What if Sumer was not the beginning of civilization? There is a kind of silence in the dust of what was once Mesopotamia and is now Iraq. It is not an empty silence. It feels dense, almost compressed, as if millennia have settled into the soil and never really left. The horizon is a flat line between baked earth and a pale, indifferent sky. And here, the wind seems to carry more than sand. It carries the ground-down remains of cities, the faint residue of languages, laws and lives that vanished long ago. In the story most of us inherit, this is where everything begins. This is the opening act of recorded history. Sumer. Even the word feels foundational. We are told that this was the cradle of civilization, the place where human beings first built cities, first wrote down laws, first tracked the heavens, first organized themselves into something larger than scattered tribes. It is a clean linear story. First there was nothing, then there was Sumer. But the dust of that land suggests another possibility, a quieter, more difficult one. What if a cradle is not only a place of birth, but also a place where something fragile is protected after almost being lost? What if we have been reading the evidence too simply? What if the story of Sumer is not really a story of invention at all, but of urgent reconstruction? Not a beginning exactly, but an echo, a restoration of something earlier, larger, and almost completely erased. An echo of what? To understand why that question matters, we have to look not only at what the Sumerians built, but at how they seem to enter history in the first place. The standard account of civilization is slow and cumulative. Small bands become villages, villages become towns, towns become cities. Knowledge grows by trial and error, piece by piece, over very long stretches of time. But with Sumer, that sequence seems to compress. In the archaeological record of southern Mesopotamia around the 4th millennium BC, the pace changes. What had looked like a gradual crawl begins to resemble a rapid surge. It is not just one innovation appearing in isolation. It is an entire cluster of systems arriving together with surprising force. We see the rise of the first true cities, places like Uruk, growing to populations of tens of thousands. This is not just a larger village, it is a new kind of organism. A city at that scale needs administration, surplus food, public works, and specialized labor. It requires a different social reality altogether. It requires citizens. Alongside the city comes codified law. Not just custom, not just oral memory, but abstract rules about justice, contracts, and property, made visible and durable. And to preserve those rules, they needed the most transformative tool of all, writing. Cuneiform does not seem to emerge as a hesitant chain of crude pictures. It appears as a surprisingly capable system, already suited to tracking grain, recording obligations, and soon after, preserving stories. Cities, laws, writing, the wheel, metallurgy, mathematics. An entire operating system for complex society seems to come online. This is the central anomaly of Sumer. The visible path leading up to it feels almost too short, too compressed, for the sophistication of what finally appears. It feels as if the opening chapters are missing, and that gives us the real question of this investigation. The one underneath the myths and underneath the dust. Did a population living on a floodplain between two rivers create the whole architecture of civilization from scratch, in one unprecedented burst of genius? Or were they working from something older? Were they designing a new world, or restoring the fragments of an earlier one? Put simply, were they innovators, or were they inheritors? That question is what turns Sumer from a familiar starting point into something much stranger. So that is the question that will guide us through the dust. Innovators or inheritors? It pulls us away from the neat, well-lit version of history and into something less stable, less comfortable, and more interesting. And a journey like that is better not taken alone. Before we go further, I want to make a brief request. These long-form investigations move slowly by design. If you value that kind of careful work, leaving a like is a small gesture that genuinely helps the video reach other curious people. And if you want to stay with us as we continue this investigation, and others like it, subscribing is the simplest way to do that. And one more thing. This story is rooted in one ancient landscape, but it is being watched across the modern world, in different cities, under different skies, in different time zones. So if you feel like sharing it in the comments, I'd genuinely like to know what time it is for you right now. It feels like a fitting way to mark our own place in time before we step back into a much older one. a small digital marker in the present, from people listening for the same distant echo. All right, thank you. Now we can begin to sift through the evidence. And the first, perhaps strongest part of the Sumerian puzzle is the claim that they appeared on the stage of history almost fully formed, as if from nowhere. The idea of a civilization arriving fully formed is powerful. It is almost a creation myth of its own. Out of the Mesopotamian dust rises a complete society, equipped with cities, laws, and writing, as though some blueprint had simply been placed into the human mind. It is a clean story, a dramatic story, and it satisfies a very old desire for singular beginnings. It leaves room for lost golden ages, forgotten teachers, and decisive moments that changed everything. For a long time, that version of Sumer has fed the imagination, but like most powerful stories, it also flattens the picture. When archaeologists work through the layered earth of southern Iraq, what appears is not a lightning strike, but something slower and more cumulative. The truth is less theatrical, but more convincing. The evidence does not support the idea of civilization appearing overnight. What it points to instead is a period of extreme and unusual acceleration. Take Uruk. By the 4th millennium BC, it was likely the largest city on Earth, a vast settlement of sun-dried brick. But it did not emerge all at once. Archaeological surveys suggest a long build-up, a drawn-out process in which smaller settlements gradually merged, expanded, and pulled people in from the surrounding countryside. Uruk was not an event, it was a process. A slow consolidation over centuries, followed by a final phase of rapid growth. The great Ziggurat stood on top of much older layers. Writing tells a similar story. Before the first recognizable cuneiform signs were pressed into clay, the people of Mesopotamia were already using another system. Small clay tokens. Simple objects, but not meaningless ones. Many researchers interpret them as accounting devices. A cone might stand for a quantity of grain. A sphere might represent livestock, a disk might mark labour. For thousands of years, these tokens seem to have functioned as a physical ledger, a way to record and manage the resources of a temple or a city. So no, the mystery does not disappear, but it does change. To be fair, accepting gradual development does not remove the anomaly. It makes it more precise. The real question is no longer how civilization appeared out of nothing, but what drove this extraordinary acceleration. What took scattered settlements and basic accounting tools, and in the space of a few centuries turned them into a literate, urban, world-shaping system? The evidence does not point to magic. It points to a practical response to a very large problem. The next question is obvious. What kind of problem requires a city of 50,000 people and the invention of writing to solve it? So if the story is not one of sudden creation, but of rapid, almost violent acceleration, then what was the engine? What was the fuel? The answer is so mundane, so aggressively unromantic, that it almost feels insulting. It lies in what those early clay tokens became when they stopped being counted in the hand and started being pressed into wet clay, leaving behind the first permanent records. When we look at those first tablets from the deep layers of Uruk, imagination wants something else. We expect the beginning of an epic, a hymn, a creation story, a poem about the stars. But that is not what is there. Most of them are lists, receipts, inventories, ledgers, 23 sheep, 500 jars of barley, rations for 7 workers. This is the hard, beautiful, inconvenient truth at the centre of civilization. Writing was not invented to express the deepest longings of the human soul. It was invented to keep accounts, and to be fair, nobody had ever faced a problem like Uruk before. How do you manage a city of tens of thousands? How do you collect grain from countless farmers and redistribute it to priests, soldiers, and craftsmen who do not grow their own food? How do you organize labour for canals that stretch for miles? Memory is not enough. Memory is personal, unstable, and easy to contest. A city needs something external, impersonal, and durable. The clay tablet provided exactly that. It was a technology for handling complexity. So the first act of recorded history is not a declaration of faith or a heroic tale. It is an economic transaction. A society larger than a village needs a system. It needs bureaucracy. The myths, the law codes, the kingship, the cosmology, all of that comes later, built on top of a much less glamorous foundation. First, the grain has to be counted. Order does not descend fully formed from the heavens. It is assembled slowly and practically, one record at a time. At first, that can feel almost disappointingly solid. The mystery of Sumer seems to collapse into administration. The great leap forward starts to look like a solution to a storage problem. The first words are not poetry, but inventory. The first laws are not moral revelations, but contracts and obligations. And for a moment it seems as if that solves it. As if the story of Sumer is simply the story of bureaucracy. Necessary, important, but not especially mysterious. But that feeling does not last. Because we have not solved the mystery. We have only cleared away the top layer. Saying that administrative need helped create civilization is true. It is also incomplete. It is like saying that the desire to fly created the airplane. True, yes. But it tells you nothing about the physics, materials, or systems that made flight possible. The deeper question is not what problem the Sumerians faced. The deeper question is what kind of conceptual tools they possessed that allowed them to solve that problem at a scale and speed that had never really been seen before. That is where the mystery sharpens again. The rise was not from zero. We can see that now. But the acceleration still seems almost vertical. How does a society move from agricultural surplus to complex urban management in what, archaeologically speaking, is barely more than a blink? How do you build the intellectual and social infrastructure required to coordinate tens of thousands of people, mobilize labour, and administer justice without a 1,000-year institutional tradition behind you? Clay and reeds are not enough. You need a framework for reality itself. And that is where the investigation has to turn, away from the hardware of Sumerian civilization, the bricks, canals, and artifacts, and toward the software, toward the invisible architecture of thought, the systems they used not only to count sheep, but to structure time, space, and authority. Because that is where the real fuel of the expansion may have been. And to get there, we have to begin with the most basic tool they left behind, a number, 60. This is where the investigation really starts to deepen. Because if the hardware of Sumerian civilization, the cities, the administration, the built environment, rested on systems of control, then what about the software? What was the operating system behind their reality? The answer is not hidden in some obscure text. It is so deeply built into our own lives that we look at it every day and barely notice it. Look at a clock, the circular face, the sweep of the hands, 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour. Why 60? Why not 100? Why not 10? The number our fingers seem to recommend. This is not just a habit. It is a ghost. A piece of 4,000-year-old code still running in the background of everyday life. One of the clearest surviving legacies of the Mesopotamian mind. This is the sexagesimal system, a method of counting based on 60 rather than 10. And this is not fringe speculation. It is a well-established fact of Mesopotamian mathematics. Our own number system is decimal, built around 10. Theirs was built around a larger and far more flexible base. 60 divides neatly by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. For fractions, measurements, and repeated division, it is extraordinarily useful, especially for a society concerned with astronomy, calendars, and the geometry of circles. And that logic did not stay local. The circle was divided into 360 degrees, 6 times 60. The sky was charted through that system. Time itself was measured through it. This is not a random survival. The basic architecture of how we divide the day, how we navigate the globe, how we describe circular space, all of that carries forward this inheritance. From the Sumerians to the Babylonians, from the Babylonians to the Greeks, and from there into the mathematical foundations of the modern world. Sit with that for a second. This is not like uncovering a broken vessel in the ground. It is more like realizing that part of the operating system of modern life was written 4 millennia ago in a culture most people only know by name. It is a ghost in the machinery of ordinary perception, alien in one sense, completely familiar in another. A line of thought that survived empire after empire, the loss of cities, the destruction of libraries, the collapse of worlds. It survived because it was useful. More than useful, really. For its purposes, it was elegant. And once you see how concrete that legacy is, it becomes easier to understand why more extravagant claims about Sumerian knowledge began to grow around it. If they gave us the structure of time itself, then what else might they have known? Did they map distant planets? Did they understand cycles we're only now recovering? This is the point where the story usually starts to drift into spectacle, and it is also the point where we need to be most careful. Because in the dust of Mesopotamia, the line between a documented inheritance and a beautiful myth can be very thin, and if we want the truth, we have to be willing to follow that line even when it leads somewhere less dramatic than we hoped. And here, in the cold, hard elegance of Base 60, we have a verifiable foundation, a system of thought so powerful it survived the collapse of empires and echoes in our digital age. It's a genuine marvel, but it's also a gateway through which a host of other more spectacular claims about Sumerian knowledge have entered our imagination. This is the point where the timeline becomes crucial, and where an honest investigation must begin to separate a culture's actual achievements from the legends that have grown around them over thousands of years. The popular narrative often presents all Mesopotamian science as a single, unified block of knowledge gifted to the earlier Sumerians in one complete package. And in that package, two-star exhibits are almost always included. The first is a small, unassuming clay tablet known as Plimpton 322. It is, without exaggeration, one of the most famous mathematical artifacts in the world. It contains what is essentially a trigonometric table, listing sets of Pythagorean triples, the numbers that satisfy the famous theorem, more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras was even born. It's an astonishing piece of abstract mathematics. The second exhibit is the so-called Venus Tablet of Amisaduqa. This is a collection of astronomical observations, a detailed log of the rising and setting of the planet Venus over a period of about 21 years. It demonstrates a capacity for systematic, long-term observation of the heavens that feels profoundly modern. These two artifacts, advanced mathematics and precise astronomy, are often presented as Exhibit A and B for the case of an impossibly advanced Sumerian science. There is just one problem, a crucial one. Neither of them is Sumerian. Let's be precise. Plimpton 322 is not a Sumerian tablet. It is Old Babylonian, dated to around 1800 BCE. That's more than 1,000 years after the rise of the first Sumerian cities. Similarly, the Venus tablet we have is a copy, made by an Assyrian scribe in the 7th century BCE, of a text that probably originated in the reign of the Babylonian king Amisaduqa, around the 17th century BCE. Again, a millennium and a half after the period we're examining. This isn't a minor detail, it changes the entire picture. The story is not about one sudden, inexplicable flash of genius at the very dawn of civilization. The story is about the slow, persistent, multi-generational work of an entire cultural tradition. The Babylonians and Assyrians were the heirs to the Sumerians. They inherited the foundational tools, cuneiform writing, the Base 60 system, and over the course of centuries they built upon them. What we're seeing is not a miracle, but a legacy, a long, unbroken chain of intellectual transmission, and this same need for chronological honesty applies to the most ambitious claim of all, that the Sumerians knew about the precession of the equinoxes, the slow, 26,000-year wobble of the Earth's axis. This knowledge would imply millennia of continuous, precise astronomical records. But the historical record is clear. The mathematical discovery and description of precession is credited to the Greek astronomer Hipparchus in the 2nd century BCE. While Mesopotamian astronomers were brilliant observers, there is no solid evidence they possessed a working model of this vast celestial cycle in the early Sumerian period. So, this isn't an act of debunking, it's an act of clarification. To compress 1,500 years of Babylonian and Assyrian intellectual history and credit it all to the very first Sumerians is to misunderstand the very nature of how knowledge works. The real wonder here is perhaps even greater than the myth. It's not about a static gift. It's about a dynamic tradition, a river of knowledge flowing through time passed from one generation to the next, from one empire to its successor. The real mystery isn't how it all appeared at once. The real mystery is how it was kept alive for so long. So, does this kill the mystery? Does correcting the timeline, separating Sumerian foundations from later Babylonian achievements, simply mean we were looking in the wrong century for the source of the miracle? For a moment it feels that way. It feels like we are deflating the central claim of a sudden impossible download of knowledge, but that's only if we assume that a single blinding flash is more wondrous than a slow persistent burn. What the evidence actually shows us is something far more profound. It's not a story about a single gift. It's the story of a transmission, a great conversation that lasted for 3,000 years, carried on through the rise and fall of empires, spoken and written in languages that were born and died within its time span. Think of it not as a finished blueprint, but as the first, foundational chapter of a book. The Sumerians wrote that chapter. They established the grammar of civilization, the city, the law, the temple, and the number 60. Then the Akkadians, speaking a completely different Semitic language, conquered them. But they didn't erase the book. They became its first translators and students. They adopted the cuneiform script. They absorbed the mathematics. Then came the Babylonians, who became the great editors and expansionists. They took the foundational mathematics of the Sumerians and built upon it, achieving a level of abstract calculation that wouldn't be seen again for more than a millennium. They took the early Sumerian lists of stars and began the systematic, patient work of observational astronomy that would eventually allow them to track the path of Venus. Then, centuries later, the Assyrians, the great archivists and imperial librarians, obsessively copied and preserved these texts, ensuring the conversation would not be lost to the fires that consumed their cities. This wasn't a single, static package of information. It was a living, evolving intellectual project, a multi-generational, multi-ethnic, multilingual effort to build a coherent model of the cosmos out of numbers and patient observation. The real miracle isn't that a single group of people suddenly knew everything. The miracle is the continuity itself. How does an idea, a system of thought, survive for 3 millennia? It requires more than just smart individuals. It requires institutions. It requires schools for scribes, where knowledge is painstakingly copied and passed on. It requires a cultural belief that what the ancestors knew is fundamentally important. It requires a shared intellectual framework so robust that it can outlive the very people and languages that first created it. So the mystery changes. It moves from where did this knowledge come from to a much deeper question. How was it kept alive? What we're looking at is not a forgotten technology, but a forgotten form of time, a sense of history and intellectual obligation that stretches across generations in a way that is almost alien to our own short-term thinking. The true anomaly of Mesopotamia isn't a lost golden age. It's the stubborn 3,000-year-long refusal to let the conversation die. And that, in its own quiet way, is more awe-inspiring than any story of a sudden gift. This brings us to a crucial point in any honest investigation. This long, slow river of Mesopotamian knowledge is a powerful current, and like any powerful current, it attracts debris. Over the years, a number of strange artifacts and compelling ideas have been pulled into the orbit of the Sumerian mystery, blurring the timeline and muddying the waters. An honest inquiry requires us to be careful curators of our evidence. We have to be willing to clean the signal, to filter out the noise, no matter how fascinating that noise might be. A classic example of this is a strange little object you may have seen online, the so-called Baghdad battery. It's a small clay jar containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod. The popular theory suggests it was a galvanic cell, a primitive battery capable of producing a small electrical charge, proving that ancient peoples had discovered electricity thousands of years before Volta. It's a seductive idea, a perfect piece for the puzzle of lost high technology. But if we are to be serious investigators, we must apply 2 simple, brutal filters to every piece of evidence, time and context. The first filter is time. The Baghdad battery, and others like it, are not Sumerian. They are not even Babylonian. According to archaeological dating, these artifacts belong to the Parthian or Sasanian periods, roughly between 250 BC and 650 AD. To connect this to the dawn of Sumerian civilization is an anachronism of staggering scale. We are talking about a gap of at least 3,000 years. It's the chronological equivalent of trying to understand the Roman Empire by studying a medieval manuscript. The worlds are simply not the same. The second filter is context. The function of the object as a battery is far from a settled fact among archaeologists. While it can produce a current, many researchers believe it's more likely that these jars were used for something else entirely, perhaps for storing sacred scrolls, with the metal elements intended to protect the papyrus or parchment from insects. The battery hypothesis remains a fringe interpretation, not an academic consensus. And this isn't just about debunking one object, it's about a principle. In an investigation this deep, the signal is everything. Every piece of evidence that is out of place, out of time, adds noise. It corrupts the data. It distracts us from the real, profound patterns that are waiting to be seen. Our goal is not to collect the largest number of mysteries, but to find the clearest line through the ones that truly matter. We have to be willing to let the weak evidence go to focus on the signal that is strongest. And once we clear away that noise, once we filter out the misplaced artifacts and the chronological confusion, what remains is stranger and far more compelling. Because the Sumerians left behind a document that isn't a physical object we can misinterpret from a distance of millennia. It's a text, a list written in their own words. And it speaks of a time before our time, of kings who ruled for impossible lifetimes, and of a world split in two by a great flood. But once the noise has been filtered out, what remains is not an empty space. What remains is a signal, a document so clear, so strange, and so deliberate that it can't be dismissed as a mere curiosity. It is an artifact that sits at the very heart of this investigation, a piece of solidified time that forces us to confront the Sumerian sense of history on its own terms. It's known today as the Sumerian King List. The most famous copy is a four-sided clay prism, now resting in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. It's barely 20 centimetres tall, a block of baked earth covered in meticulous rows of cuneiform script. It feels solid, official. This is not a poem or a myth whispered around a fire. This is a record, an attempt by the scribes of a later Mesopotamian age to compile a single, authoritative history of power, a definitive answer to the question, who ruled and in what order? It lists cities and the kings who reigned from them, creating a chain of legitimacy stretching back into the deepest shadows of memory. And as you read down this pillar of text, a clear structure emerges, city after city, king after king. But then you come to a line that acts as a profound rupture in the very fabric of this history. It reads, "After the flood swept over and the kingship descended from heaven." The kingship was in Kish, before the flood, and after the flood. The entire history of the world, as this document presents it, is split in two by a single catastrophic event. But it's what comes before that line that stops you cold. The list begins not with a handful of legendary ancestors, but with a dynasty of 8 kings who ruled from 5 cities. Their reigns are recorded with the same bureaucratic precision as all the others, and their numbers are impossible. The first king, Alulim of Eridu, is said to have ruled for 28,800 years. His successor, Alalngar, ruled for 36,000 years. The list continues, city by city, king by king. Enmenluana of Bad Tibira, 43,200 years. Dumuzid, the shepherd, 36,000 years. In total, these 8 kings are credited with a combined reign of 241,000. 200 years, then the flood sweeps over, and everything changes. The kingship descends again, this time to the city of Kish, and while the reign lengths of the first post-flood kings are still exaggerated, they are on a completely different scale. They drop from tens of thousands of years to hundreds, and then slowly they begin to approach the familiar fragile span of a human life. The document itself is telling us that there were 2 different kinds of time, a deep, almost geological time of the world before, and the hurried, mortal time of the world after. We are left holding a document from a profoundly logical, mathematically obsessed culture, a document that presents us with numbers that defy all logic. This is not a simple fairy tale, it is a structured, systematic list. So the question is not whether these kings literally lived for 36,000 years. The question is, what is this document truly counting? What is this code for a lost world? A world before the water? And so we are left staring at the numbers on the clay, and they stare back with a cold, inhuman gaze. 28,800 years, 36,000 years, 43,200 years. These are not the lifespans of kings. They are not even the lifespans of dynasties. They are geological timescales assigned to single individuals. A historian, looking at this, has 2 choices. The first is simple. Dismiss it. Label it as pure myth, the primitive exaggerations of a people with no real concept of deep time, and move on to the more reasonable numbers after the flood. It's the safe, sensible path. But the second choice is more difficult and far more tempting. It is to assume that the scribe who meticulously pressed these numbers into clay was not a fool. To assume that these numbers are not random, but deliberate. That this isn't a failure of history, but a success of mathematics. What if we are not reading a list, but a code? This is the hypothesis that has captivated researchers for decades. The idea that hidden within these impossible reigns is a rational, elegant system. When you look closely, a pattern begins to emerge from the noise. Many of the reigns are multiples of a specific number. That number is 3,600. In the Sumerian system, this unit had a name, Asar. It represents 60 multiplied by 60, a cornerstone of their base 60 mathematics. Suddenly the numbers are no longer just arbitrarily large, they are structured. A king who ruled for 36,000 years, for example, ruled for 10 sars. And this is where the theory takes a breathtaking leap, from the neat order of mathematics on a clay tablet, outwards to the silent clockwork motion of the cosmos. For what kind of cycle could a unit of 3,600 years possibly measure? Not the seasons, not the phases of the moon, not even the long, slow wobble of a planet. It points to something far grander. Some researchers have connected it to the most majestic and slow-moving cycle in our planet's celestial dance, the precession of the equinoxes. This is the slow, conical wobble of the Earth's axis, which completes one full circle in roughly 25,920 years, the so-called Great Year. It is a cycle so vast that it shifts the entire zodiac over millennia. While there is no direct proof that the early Sumerians had calculated this, the numbers they used in their myths operate on this same epic scale. This Sar of 3,600 years feels like a unit designed to measure not human history but cosmic history. In this light, the King List transforms. It ceases to be a primitive tale of immortal kings. It becomes a stunningly sophisticated document, a celestial timetable. The reigns are no longer lifespans, but markers for astronomical epochs, vast passages of time tracked against the slow drift of the stars. The pre-flood kings are not men. They are custodians of an age. Their names assigned to chapters in the Earth's long journey through the heavens. It's an elegant, almost perfect solution. It rescues the document from the realm of fantasy and elevates it to the realm of forgotten science. It suggests that before the flood, there was a civilization that thought in terms of millennia, a people whose history was written in the language of the stars. But as beautiful as it is, this remains a speculative interpretation. It's an attempt to find a signal in what might just be mythic noise. What if the code isn't pointing outwards, towards the stars? What if its message is entirely terrestrial? What if the key to understanding these numbers lies not in astronomy, but in the very nature of power itself? But what if we're asking the wrong question? What if the numbers aren't a secret code for understanding the cosmos, but a very public code for understanding power? The astronomical hypothesis is elegant. It's grand. It connects the dust of Mesopotamia to the silent turning of the stars. But there is another reading, a reading that is quieter, more earthly, and in many ways far more revealing about the nature of civilization itself. To find it, we have to stop looking at the King List as a message sent to us from the deep past and start looking at it as a document written for a very specific audience, in a very specific time. We have to ask the most pragmatic question in any investigation. Who paid the scribe? The consensus among historians, and the position held by institutions like the Ashmolean Museum, is that the King List wasn't written in the mythical time before the flood. It was likely compiled much later, around the beginning of the 2nd millennium BC, during a period of intense political instability. The great empire of the 3rd dynasty of Ur had collapsed, and southern Mesopotamia was a fractured landscape of competing city-states, all vying for dominance. In this chaotic world, what a new king needed more than anything was not a star chart, it was legitimacy. And this is the key. The Sumerian King List is not a work of science, it is a masterpiece of political theology. Its primary job is to create the illusion of unity where there was none. Look at how it's structured. After the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. Then, after Kish, it moves to Uruk, then to Ur. It presents history as a neat relay race, where the sacred baton of kingship is held by only one city at a time. But we know from archaeological records that this is a deliberate fiction. In reality, many of these cities ruled concurrently, fighting each other for resources and influence. The history was a messy, overlapping web. The list flattens this web into a single, clean, authoritative line. Why? Because the scribes who wrote it were most likely working for the rulers of a city called Izin. By creating this grand, linear history, they were performing an act of breathtaking political engineering. They were saying that the one true kingship, an institution created by the gods themselves before the flood, had been passed down through a single unbroken chain, a chain that ended, conveniently, with their own patrons. It's an argument carved in clay. The authority that began in heaven now rests here, with us. This doesn't make the list a lie. It makes it something far more complex and powerful. It's a canon, and a canon is a technology for controlling memory. It takes the chaotic, contradictory events of the past and organizes them into a single, official story that serves the present. The impossible numbers of the antediluvian kings are not there to record astronomical data. They are there to create a sense of immense, inhuman antiquity, to anchor the present political order in a time so deep it feels eternal. The King List is not a window into a lost world of science. It's a mirror, reflecting the anxieties and ambitions of a kingdom trying to carve its authority out of chaos. This brings us to a much deeper level of the investigation. We've called the King List a political message, a claim of legitimacy, but that's too soft. It's not just a message, it's a technology for manufacturing the past in order to control the present. To understand how it works, we have to understand the power of a list, the power of a canon. A canon is the official story, it's the authorized version. In a world of infinite possibilities, competing histories, and messy, contradictory memories, a canon draws a single, clean line. It says, this is what matters. This is the correct order. This is the reality you will inhabit. Everything outside this line is chaos, heresy, or simply forgotten. It is the ultimate tool of order. And the Sumerian King List is one of the most brilliant and ruthless uses of this technology ever conceived. Its genius lies in its sheer, uncompromising linearity. It presents kingship not as something that is won or built or earned through merit. It presents kingship as a singular object, a divine power that is handed down from heaven. It can only ever be in one place, at one time. Think about what this does. Before the flood, it resides in Eridu, then it passes to Bad Tibera, and so on. After the flood, the text says, kingship was once again lowered from heaven, and it came to the city of Kish. Not to Uruk, not to Ur, but to Kish. From that moment on, every other city, every other ruler who might claim power is, by definition, an illegitimate usurper. They are rebels against a divinely ordained, historically recorded order. This is not history. This is a weapon forged from clay and time. By creating this unbroken chain of command stretching all the way back to the gods themselves, the scribes of Essene were not simply recording their heritage. They were erasing every other possible heritage. They were building a prison of legitimacy around their rivals. The list is a declaration that there is only one history, one timeline, one rightful flow of power, and it flows directly to them. Here, we touch upon a fundamental truth about civilization, one that's often lost in our search for ancient mysteries. The archive is never a passive window. It is an active instrument of power. The act of writing something down, of placing it in a sequence, of carving it into a permanent medium. This is an act of creation. It decides what will be remembered, and therefore, what is real. And just as powerful is the decision of what to leave out. The silences in the archive are as loud as the words. Every name not on that list is a ghost, a political project that was deliberately forgotten, written out of the official story. So we must see this prism not just as a relic, but as an engine for turning myth into fact, and fact into law. It takes the terrifying, chaotic reality of history, a story of wars, coups, and broken dynasties, and transforms it into a serene, inevitable procession, guided by the will of the gods. It tells the people of Mesopotamia not just who their ruler is, but why they must obey him. His power is not an accident of the present. It is a consequence of the entire past. This is a crucial lesson. The past is not a passive landscape we simply discover. It is an active territory constantly being shaped, curated, and weaponized by the present. The Sumerian King List is not a window into a lost world. It is a carefully constructed throne, built from the bones of history and myth, designed to seat only one king at a time. It's a technology of power. And just when this conclusion seems to lock the mystery into a neat political box, the dust offers a complication, an uncomfortable fact. Because if a canon is a tool for manufacturing the past, its engineers know that the most effective constructions are not built from pure fantasy. They are built on a foundation of truth. You have to look deep into the list to find it. You scroll past the god-kings of Eridu with their geological reigns, past names that feel like echoes from a dream, and then suddenly a name appears that does not feel like an echo. It rings with the hard, sharp clarity of carved stone. The name is Enmebaragesi, king of Kish. According to the list, he reigned for 900 years, a clear mark of legend. So why pause here? Why is this name different from all the others in that early, myth-shrouded section? Because we have found it, not just on another copy of the list but elsewhere, etched into alabaster vase fragments, excavated from the temple ruins at Nippur, authentic inscriptions from his own time. According to our current archaeological record, Enmebaragesi is the first ruler from the Sumerian King List, whose existence can be independently verified. He is the first ghost to leave a physical footprint. This is a profound moment. It doesn't validate the 28,000-year reign of his predecessor. It certainly doesn't prove the astronomical code. But what it does prove is that the architects of this canon were not simply inventing from whole cloth. They were weaving their grand political narrative with threads of genuine, verifiable historical memory. They reached back into the deep past, took a real king, a figure of established historical weight, and made him a link in their perfect, unbroken chain of power. So the King List is not a binary choice between fact and fiction. It is something far more complex and far more human. It is a work of statecraft where real history is captured, repurposed, and embedded into a larger legitimizing myth. Real people, real events, are absorbed into the official story, lending it the weight of reality, while the story, in turn, grants them a new, eternal significance. The list is not a lie. It is a reordering of all known truth to serve a single purpose. It anchors itself in reality with names like Enmebaragesi, making its grander claims feel more plausible. And the grandest claim of all, the event that serves as the Great Wall in its timeline, is the one it returns to with solemn finality. After cataloguing the antediluvian kings and their impossible reigns, the text states simply, "Then the flood swept over." For the scribes of Essene, this was not just a story. It was the fundamental rupture in time. And so, the next question for our investigation becomes unavoidable. If a name from the mythic past can turn out to be real, could the flood be real too? And so the King List stands before us, a monument of text. It draws a line in time, sharp and absolute. Then the flood swept over, a literary device, a mythological reset button. A way for a new dynasty to claim its power began after the world was washed clean. This is the safe, rational interpretation. And it would be enough if the story ended there, if the memory of the water had remained trapped in the silent, ordered lines of cuneiform on a clay prism. But what if it wasn't just a story? What if the flood was a physical memory written not in script but in the earth itself? To even ask that question in the early 20th century was to blur the line between archaeology and theology. But it was a time of spectacular discoveries. The 1920s were electric with the promise of the past. In 1922, Howard Carter had opened the tomb of Tutankhamun in Egypt, and the world was gripped by a fever for forgotten kings and buried gold. It was in this same atmosphere of grand expectation that a British archaeologist named Sir Leonard Woolley was working, not in the celebrated sands of Egypt, but in the deeper, more ancient dust of southern Mesopotamia. His focus was a vast, sprawling mound of ruins known as Tel al-Muqayyar. It was the site of the ancient Sumerian capital, the city of Ur. For years, Woolley and his team worked under the punishing sun, meticulously descending through the layers of the city. Archaeology is a patient art. You move backwards in time with every foot of earth you remove. Each layer is a distinct chapter. The dusty floors of a Neo-Babylonian house, the shattered pottery of a Kassite settlement, the foundations of a temple from the age of the Great Ziggurat. And deeper still, the team uncovered a royal cemetery, filled with treasures of gold and lapis lazuli that stunned the world and proved the stories of Sumerian wealth were no mere legend. They were digging through history chapter by chapter, and then, one day in 1929, the history stopped. The workers, digging a deep pit to understand the city's earliest foundations, went past the lowest level of royal graves. They went past the last identifiable layer of human settlement, the last fleck of charcoal, the last shard of pottery. And they hit a layer of nothing. It was clean, uniform clay, the kind of fine silt left behind by settled water. Woolley, a veteran of excavation, knew what it meant. This was a sterile layer. No one had lived in it. Nothing had been built on it. It was a pause, an interruption in the story. His workmen were convinced they had hit the bottom, the virgin soil beneath the city. But something troubled Woolley. He ordered them to keep digging. They dug deeper, 1 foot, 2 feet, 5 feet. Still nothing but the same clean, water-laid silt. The pit grew deeper and deeper, and the sheer thickness of this empty layer became a presence in itself. It was a wall of silence in the geological record. Finally, after digging through more than 8 feet of sterile clay, the workers' spades hit something new. They had broken through, and what they found beneath was another layer of civilization. But it was different. The pottery was from a much earlier prehistoric period. Woolley stood at the edge of the pit and looked down. He saw the story of Ur laid bare. A thriving early culture. Then an immense 8-foot-thick blanket of silt. And then, after the silence, the glorious dynasties of Sumer begin again. For him, the evidence was undeniable. This was not a local flood. A river overflowing its banks wouldn't leave a deposit this massive and this uniform. This was something else. This was the scar left by a cataclysm. In that moment, looking into the earth, Woolley believed he was looking at the physical proof of the Great Flood, the very event the old scribes had written about on the King List. The story, he declared to an astonished world, was true. Woolley's discovery was electrifying. Back in London, the headlines declared it in bold, unequivocal terms: the Bible's great flood had been found. For a world still grappling with the scale of its own recent man-made catastrophe, the idea of an ancient world-washing cataclysm being archaeologically verified was a story of immense power. It seemed to confirm that the oldest myths were not just stories but memories, and for a time, this was the accepted truth. Woolley's 8-foot layer of sterile water-laid clay was the physical proof, the silent witness. But science, over time, has drawn a more complicated map. Woolley's discovery was real. The layer of silt was real. His interpretation, however, was a product of its time, a brilliant, dramatic leap that connected his trench in the desert to one of humanity's most enduring stories. Subsequent archaeology hasn't overturned his finding, but it has profoundly reframed it. The picture is now more detailed, more chaotic, and in many ways more interesting. Here is what we can say with a reasonable degree of certainty. The flood layer at Ur is too old to line up perfectly with the literary accounts of the hero Ziusudra. But, and this is the crucial point, archaeologists later found similar, catastrophic flood deposits at other ancient Sumerian cities, at Kish, at Shuruppak, the very city the King List names as the home of the flood survivor. These layers are not identical. They don't all date to the exact same year. They don't form a single, neat geological blanket across the entire region. What the accumulated evidence suggests is not one singular global deluge that covered the mountains of Ararat. Instead, it points to a series of devastating, large-scale river floods that inundated the vast, flat plains of southern Mesopotamia around the beginning of the 3rd millennium BC. These were not the annual predictable floods that nourished the fields. These were violent, city-destroying incursions of water, events that would have scoured the landscape clean, burying towns and villages under a thick shroud of mud. For the people who lived there, on that low-lying land between the two rivers, this was a world-ending event. Their world was the plain, and when the plain disappeared beneath a vast brown sea, their world was over. This wasn't a debunking of the myth, it was its anchor. It grounded the story of the Great Flood not in planetary fantasy, but in a real, recurring regional trauma. The Sumerian and later Babylonian accounts weren't describing a distant memory of a global event. They were consolidating the terrifyingly immediate memory of local apocalypses into a single, foundational myth. This changes everything. The flood was not just a story passed down, it was a living fear, a geological reality that shaped the Mesopotamian psyche. It created a world divided into two distinct epochs, the time before the water and the time after. It is the ultimate expression of civilizational fragility, a demonstration that everything built by human hands, cities, temples, archives, could be erased in a single season by the blind, indifferent power of the rivers. The trauma was real, it was physical, it was buried in the very ground they rebuilt their world upon. And once a trauma of that magnitude is etched into the landscape, the next question becomes inevitable. How is it etched into the soul? How does a memory of mud and water become an epic? This is how a real event becomes a memory, and this is how a memory becomes a myth. A layer of sterile silt buried under the foundations of a city is a geological fact. It is a silent physical witness to a catastrophe. But human beings do not live by geology alone. We live by stories, and the story of the flood is infinitely more powerful than the fact of it. The question we must ask is not just if the flood happened, but how it was remembered. Cultural memory is not a perfect archive. It does not store events in chronological order, neatly catalogued and dated. It is a living, breathing thing. It compresses, it edits, it looks for patterns. Generations of people living in the river valleys of Mesopotamia experienced devastating but separate floods. A lifetime of work could be washed away in a single season. An entire village could vanish. These were individual, terrifying traumas scattered across time and space. But memory, over centuries, smooths out these individual tragedies. It melts them down. It recasts them into a single archetypal event. The many floods become the flood. 100 different moments of despair and survival are compressed into one epic story of a world washed clean. It is a process of brutal poetic efficiency. The messy, recurring vulnerability of life by the river is transformed into a single, clean scar on the face of history. Why is this story so powerful? Why does it persist across cultures and millennia? Because it offers something that raw history cannot: meaning, and a new beginning. A great flood is the ultimate great reset. It draws a line through time so absolute that everything can be defined as either before or after. It offers the terrifying comfort of a clean slate. The old world with its corruptions and mistakes is gone. The new world, born from the water, is a second chance. For a society rebuilding itself from the mud, this isn't just a story, it's a psychological necessity. It frames the survivors not as the unlucky few, but as the chosen ones. More than that, the myth transforms a random act of nature into a deliberate act of the divine. A flood is meaningless chaos, but a flood sent by the gods is an act of judgment. It's an answer to the eternal human question: why do we suffer? The myth says we suffer because there is an order to the universe, and that order was violated. The flood wasn't just an event, it became an explanation. And the survival of a single boat, a single family, was not a matter of chance. It was the signing of a new contract between humanity and the powers that govern its existence. This transformation, from geological trauma to theological drama, from a local disaster to a world-altering myth, is one of the most powerful creative acts in human history. And this process did not just happen in the abstract. It was captured, refined, and given its most enduring voice in the world's first great work of literature. And this is where all the threads we've followed finally converge. The geological fact of the silt, the political function of the King List, and the psychological process of turning trauma into myth, they all need a vessel. A story powerful enough to carry the weight of a drowned world through the millennia. A story that can outlive the memory of the men who first told it. That story is the Epic of Gilgamesh. It is arguably the oldest surviving work of great literature on Earth. Carved into 12 clay tablets, it tells the story of a king wrestling with his own mortality. In his desperate search for eternal life, Gilgamesh travels to the ends of the earth to find the one man said to have cheated death, Utnapishtim, an impossibly ancient figure, a survivor from another age. When Gilgamesh finally finds him, he asks the old man his secret, and Utnapishtim tells him a story of a time when the gods grew angry with humanity and decided to wash the world clean with a great flood. But one god, Ea, took pity on Utnapishtim and secretly instructed him to build a great boat, to gather the seed of all living things, and to seal himself inside. He tells of the storm that turned day into night, of the waters that submerged the mountains, and of the silence that followed when all other life had been extinguished. This is the literary echo of the silt layer found at Ur. It is the narrative heart of the single sentence in the King List. Then the flood swept over. Here, the event is no longer a silent geological scar or a political tool. It is a human story, filled with terror, loss, and miraculous survival. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the final, crystallized form of this deep cultural memory. It is the monument that Mesopotamia built to its greatest trauma, a story so fundamental that it was copied and retold for centuries, its own echoes rippling forward into the flood stories of other cultures, including the Book of Genesis. The story proved to be more durable than the empires that told it. The clay tablets survived, even when the cities burned. The memory of the water was immortalized. And with that memory, so too was the memory of the beings who controlled it. The capricious, powerful, and terrifying gods who held the fate of humanity in their hands. The very same gods named in the King List, the Anunnaki. And so, in the great silence that follows the flood, a new world begins. The waters have receded, leaving behind a blank slate of mud and memory. The survivors, clinging to the wreckage of their past, face an impossible task, to rebuild not just their homes, but an entire civilization. According to the myths, they are not alone. There are figures who watch from above, who decreed the destruction, and who will now sanction the rebirth. They are the source of kingship, the arbiters of fate, the givers of law. In the Sumerian texts, they are called the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came down. For centuries this was simply mythology. The Anunnaki were understood as a pantheon of powerful, often capricious gods and goddesses, sky beings who governed the world from a distance, their motives as vast and unknowable as the heavens themselves. They were figures of worship and fear, the subjects of hymns and incantations. But in the 20th century, another story began to be told, a radical rereading of these ancient texts that has since taken powerful root in the modern imagination. This new story asks a simple, world-altering question. What if the Sumerians weren't describing gods? What if they were describing people? This is the theory that has come to define the popular mystery of Sumer. In this version of the past, the Anunnaki are stripped of their divinity and recast as physical beings. They are not spirits or metaphors, but engineers, scientists, and administrators. The quote 9 they came from were not a metaphysical realm, but a literal, physical place. Whether that place was another planet, or a now vanished highly advanced civilization here on Earth, the core idea is the same. The Anunnaki were flesh and blood beings with a technology so advanced it was indistinguishable from magic to early humans. The logic is seductive. It offers a single, elegant solution to every anomaly we have encountered. Where did the sudden explosion of civilization come from? It was a transfer of technology. How did the Sumerians possess mathematical and astronomical knowledge that seems far ahead of their time? They were taught. Who were the impossibly long-lived kings before the flood? They were the Anunnaki themselves, or their direct descendants, living out biological lifespans that seemed godlike to ordinary mortals. In this narrative, the ancient myths are not myths at all. They are a distorted historical record, a quote 10 in reverse, where a primitive people tried to describe advanced science using the only language they had, the language of gods and magic. The tablets are not religious texts but logs and reports. The hymns are not prayers, but technical manuals misunderstood. The flood is no longer a divine judgment, but perhaps a failed geoengineering project or a natural catastrophe that even this advanced civilization could not prevent. This interpretation is powerful because it feels rational. It replaces the messy, ambiguous world of faith and mythology with the clean, structured world of science and history. It makes our most distant ancestors participants in a story we understand, one of teachers and students, of knowledge lost and found, of a forgotten science waiting to be rediscovered in the dust. It suggests that humanity did not have to climb out of the darkness alone. It suggests we had help. However, this powerful image of cosmic engineers, of benevolent teachers descending from the heavens to reboot civilization, has a problem. It's a problem that isn't found in a missing piece of evidence or a gap in our knowledge. The problem is the evidence we actually have. The clay tablets themselves, when read on their own terms, tell a different, more complex and arguably more profound story. When we look for the Anunnaki in the vast library of cuneiform texts, we do not find a consistent historical group of individuals. There is no clear record of a team of named engineers with specific assignments. Instead, what emerges is something far more fluid and abstract. According to the academic consensus, grounded in decades of textual analysis, the Anunnaki are not a race of ancient astronauts. They are a class of deities, a collective of divine beings within the vast and shifting Mesopotamian pantheon. Even the precise meaning of their name remains uncertain, and their role, their number, even their level of importance changes dramatically depending on which text you read and from which century it comes. In some of the earliest myths, they are the most powerful gods in the pantheon. In later stories like the Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish, they are demoted to a council of gods, subordinate to younger, more prominent deities like Marduk. Sometimes they are the 7 judges of the underworld. Sometimes they are the collective children of Anu, the god of the sky. What we see is not a historical account, but a theological concept evolving over time. The Anunnaki are not the pilots of spacecraft. They are the personified forces of the universe. They are the agents of cosmic order, the enforcers of fate, the silent council that decrees the destinies of both gods and humans. They represent a fundamental Mesopotamian idea, that the universe is not random, but is governed by a set of powerful, inscrutable principles. They are the divine bureaucracy of reality itself. To see them as literal engineers is, in a way, to shrink them. It replaces a vast, complex idea about the nature of existence with a simple story about advanced technology. The sober reading of the text doesn't destroy the mystery, it deepens it. The question is no longer quote 11, but rather quote 12. This moves the investigation away from artifacts and onto the plane of ideas. If the Anunnaki were the divine governors of this system, then what was the substance of their governance? What exactly did they control? The texts are very clear on this. They were the guardians of the fundamental principles of civilization, the keepers of the blueprints for an ordered world, and those blueprints had a name. They were called the Me. So if the Anunnaki are not a board of cosmic engineers, and the great reboot of civilization after the flood was not a simple transfer of technology, then what was it? How does a world begin again? What is the first thing you need to rebuild a society from the mud? It's not a tool. It's not a blueprint. It's a set of rules, an operating system, and the Sumerians had a word for this. It is one of the most important and most misunderstood concepts in all of Mesopotamian thought. The word is Me. In the modern search for lost secrets, the Me have often been imagined as physical objects, as divine data chips, cosmic USB drives, or crystal tablets containing the schematics for advanced technology, handed down from gods to men. This is a tempting image because it fits our own technological worldview. It makes the past legible to the present by turning ancient philosophy into ancient engineering. But it is a profound misreading. The Me were not objects, they were principles. Think of them not as the blueprints for civilization, but as the laws of physics that allow civilization to exist at all. They are the software, not the hardware. The Sumerian texts list them, over 100 of them. They are the fundamental ordinances, the divine powers, the essential concepts that separate an ordered world from primordial chaos. The list is breathtaking in its scope. It includes kingship and priesthood. It includes truth, justice, and peace. But it also includes falsehood, strife, and fear. It contains the arts of the scribe, the musician, and the smith, the craft of the leatherworker and the weaver. It contains wisdom and counsel, judgment and decision. It contains everything that makes a city and a human being a member of a society. The Me are the invisible architecture of reality. They are not created by humans. They are bestowed by the gods, and crucially, they are not static. They can be held, transferred, and even stolen. This is the entire point of one of the most famous Sumerian myths, the story of the goddess Inanna and the god of wisdom, Enki. Inanna, the ambitious patron goddess of the city of Uruk, travels to Eridu, the ancient city of Enki. She sits with him and they drink beer together, feast after feast, until the wise old god, in his drunken generosity, offers his beloved guest a gift. One by one he gives her the holy me, he gives her sovereignty, he gives her the divine offices, the holy scepter, the sacred shrine. He gives her the art of the hero, the power of deceit, the craft of the carpenter, the skill of the basket weaver. Inanna accepts them all, loads them onto her boat of heaven, and makes her escape back to Uruk. When Enki sobers up, he is horrified by what he has done. He has given away the very essence of his city's power, the source of its cosmic legitimacy. He sends his demonic servants to chase her down and retrieve the me, but Inanna, with cleverness and divine aid, makes it back to her city. And as the me are unloaded onto the shores of Uruk, civilization is effectively transferred. Uruk becomes the new center of the world. This story tells us everything we need to know. Civilization is not an achievement, but a possession. It is a portable, divine operating system that can be acquired. The survival of a city depends on its ability to hold and maintain these sacred powers. This is how the Sumerians understood the transmission of culture. It was not a slow evolution of ideas. It was the active, often dangerous transfer of divine ordinances. These were the true gifts of the gods, not technology, but the conceptual framework for an ordered life. But if this divine software, this list of intangible powers, was the soul of their civilization, it needed a body. It needed a physical place to be anchored, an axis between the world of men and the divine plane from which these powers originated, a man-made mountain reaching from the flat earth into the silent sky. And so, we are left with this framework of divine principles, the me, a celestial operating system for civilization. But an abstract code, no matter how powerful, needs hardware. It needs a physical address in the world. It needs a place where the intangible order of the heavens can touch the messy, horizontal reality of human life. In the flat, featureless plains of Mesopotamia, a landscape defined by 2 rivers and a vast empty sky, the Sumerians built that address. They built it out of clay and bitumen, step by monumental step. They built the Ziggurat. The popular imagination, fueled by a century of speculative fiction, sees these structures and thinks of spaceports. It sees a landing pad for celestial vehicles, a piece of ancient alien infrastructure. This is a modern projection, an attempt to translate a sacred mystery into a technological one. But the reality, as understood through their own context, is something far more profound. The Ziggurat was not a landing pad. It was a ladder. In a land that was terrifyingly flat, constantly threatened by the formless chaos of floods. To build a mountain was an act of creation. It was to impose a vertical axis onto a horizontal world. The Ziggurat was an artificial mountain, a fixed point of stability and aspiration, connecting the earth below with the realm of the gods above. It was a machine of mediation, a place where a deity could be coaxed to descend and dwell among mortals, and where mortals in turn could ascend to meet the divine. But here is the crucial point, the one that reveals the true function of these structures. Not everyone was allowed to climb. The Ziggurat was not a public cathedral. Its very architecture was a diagram of power. The broad staircases at the base were for processions, for the community to witness the ritual. But as you moved higher, up the narrowing tiers, the path became more exclusive. According to the British Museum's analysis of these structures, access to the temple at the very top was reserved for a select few, the highest priests and perhaps the king himself. This is not a technical specification. This is a political one. The Ziggurat makes social hierarchy physical. It carves the structure of society into the landscape. To be at the bottom is to be part of the collective. To be at the top is to be the sole intermediary between the city and its patron god. The person who climbs that final staircase is the person who controls the flow of legitimacy, who interprets the divine will, who holds the ultimate sanction for the earthly order. The Ziggurat, then, is a silent, perpetual declaration. Power comes from above, and only the authorized may access it. It stands as a monument not just to their gods, but to their understanding of order. An order based on hierarchy, on controlled access, on the careful mediation between the human and the divine. A silent, colossal piece of hardware built to run the abstract software of civilization. And while the Ziggurats now stand as silent, eroded mountains of brick, the Sumerians left behind another monument, one made not of clay, but of sound and symbols, and it is arguably the most profound and impenetrable mystery of all. We've looked at the hardware of their world, the clay of their cities, the steps of their ziggurats. We've examined the software, the divine principles of the me, the political technology of the King List. But all of this, the structures, the laws, the memories, is ultimately powered by one thing, the operating system of human thought itself, language. And this is where we arrive at the final, and perhaps the deepest, mystery of Sumer. Most languages have a family. They have cousins, distant relatives, a traceable ancestry. English is part of the great Indo-European family tree, a branch that connects it to German, to Russian, to Persian, and to Hindi. If you trace its lineage back far enough, you find a common root, a single ancestral voice. This is the norm. It is how linguistic history is written, a vast interconnected web of sound and meaning stretching across continents and millennia. And then there is Sumerian. The Sumerian language is what historical linguists call a language isolate. The term is deceptively simple. It means that it stands utterly alone. It has no known ancestors. It has no known relatives, living or dead. It is a voice without an echo. It is a linguistic orphan, a tree with no other branches, whose roots disappear into a past so deep we can no longer see them. This is not a fringe theory. It is the mainstream consensus view. After more than a century of trying, no one has been able to convincingly connect Sumerian to any other known language family on Earth. It simply appears in the archaeological record in southern Mesopotamia, fully formed, complex, and without any obvious predecessor. Now, it's tempting to see this isolation as immediate proof of some extraordinary origin, a language downloaded from an external source. But the more honest, and perhaps more profound explanation, lies in the nature of time and evidence. The immense gulf of 5,000 years is more than enough to erase entire language families from history. The relatives of Sumerian may have existed, spoken by neighbouring peoples, but they were never written down. Or if they were recorded on perishable materials like wood or leather that have long since turned to dust. The survival of Sumerian is an accident of its medium. It survived because it was pressed into wet clay, and that clay endured. Its potential cousins, spoken by other peoples, left no such durable ghost. So, its isolation may not be a sign of a unique origin, but a testament to the fragility of all the other voices that have been lost to the silence of deep time. And yet, the mystery remains. We can translate Sumerian. We can read their hymns, their contracts, their laments. We can understand the meaning of their words, but we cannot place their voice. It speaks to us across the millennia from a void, a complete system of thought and grammar that seems to have no precedent and left no descendants. It is the ultimate cold case in the history of a language, a puzzle that resists all our modern tools of comparison, and it leaves us with a stark, unsettling question. What does it mean for a civilization's entire way of thinking to be so profoundly, so completely, alone? This is the temptation. When faced with a true, irreducible mystery like the Sumerian language, the mind rebels against the idea of a simple dead end. It refuses to accept that something so complex could simply be, without a lineage, without a reason. And so, in the great silence where comparative linguistics falls quiet, another kind of listening begins. A more speculative, more poetic kind of listening. This is where we step away from the solid ground of archaeology and into a far more abstract territory. The question shifts from where did this language come from to what was this language for? We know they used it for accounting, for laws, for history, but what if its primary function was something else entirely? What if its unique, isolated structure wasn't an accident of history but a feature of its design? Consider their world. It was a world animated by the spoken word. Hymns were not just songs, they were engines to maintain the cosmos. Incantations were not just pleas, they were tools to bend reality. The correct arrangement of sounds, uttered in the correct way, had tangible power. This is not a modern fantasy. It is the core of their magical and religious thinking. The name of a thing was inseparable from its essence. To speak was to create. To name was to control. And this is where the temptation takes hold. There are studies, speculative to be sure, that suggest some of the great Sumerian hymns and myths possess an underlying mathematical structure, proportions that echo musical harmony. What if this wasn't just poetic flair? What if the language itself was engineered to resonate with the fundamental patterns of reality? What if Sumerian was not a tool to describe the world, but a tool to interface with it? A kind of vibrational code, a programming language for the material universe. It's a beautiful thought. It's almost irresistible. It suggests that the loss of Sumerian was not just the death of a language, but the severing of a connection, a catastrophic loss of function. The myth of the Tower of Babel, where humanity's single tongue is shattered, suddenly takes on a new, more tragic meaning. It's not a punishment for arrogance, but the story of a species losing its source code, left with a fragmented library of incompatible dialects, each one a pale echo of the original functional tongue. Of course, we cannot prove this. There is no tablet that spells out this theory. This is a metaphor. But perhaps it's a useful one. It helps us feel the weight of what was lost. It frames their language not as a primitive relic, but as a lost technology of consciousness. A system where sound, mathematics, and meaning were fused into a single coherent tool for shaping the world. Perhaps the Ziggurat wasn't just a ladder to the heavens, but an antenna, and the hymns chanted within it were not just prayers, but transmissions. And so, we stand at the edge of a great abyss. It is tempting to believe in a lost world, to hear the echoes of a primordial song in the structure of this lonely language. The idea that Sumerian was not just a language, but a code, a direct interface with the mathematical structure of reality, is a beautiful and powerful metaphor. It satisfies our deepest desire for a past that was not just different, but more profound than our present. It suggests a world where words had the power to shape reality, not just describe it. A world we have lost. But this is where an honest investigation must pause and take a deep breath. Because after all the speculation, after all the poetic leaps, we are left with a simple, hard, and irreducible fact. We do not know where the Sumerian language came from. Generations of the world's most brilliant linguists have searched for its family, its distant cousins, its ancestors. They have compared it to every known language group on Earth, from the Caucasus to the Indus Valley and beyond. And the result is always the same. Nothing. The trail goes cold in the Mesopotamian dust. The language stands alone, a linguistic orphan in the history of humanity. And perhaps this is the most important lesson of all. The mystery of the Sumerian language is not a puzzle waiting for a clever solution. It is a boundary. It is a clear, sharp line that shows us the limits of our own knowledge. The past is not a complete text that we can one day hope to fully translate. It is a ruin. And some parts of that ruin have been so thoroughly reclaimed by time that no amount of digging will ever recover them. The silence of the record is not a failure of our investigation. The silence is the finding. Our modern world is uncomfortable with such silence. We have a deep-seated need to fill every void, to connect every dot, to construct a complete and total narrative. When history presents us with a genuine gap, we rush to fill it with our own stories. Stories of lost continents, of ancient astronauts, of secret societies preserving forgotten knowledge. These narratives are compelling, but they often say more about our own anxieties, our fear of the unknown, our desire for a hidden order, than they do about the past itself. We project our longing for meaning back into the dust, and mistake it for a discovery. But to truly listen to the past, we must also learn to listen to its silences, to accept that some doors are closed forever, to stand before the mystery of the Sumerian language and to say, with humility and with respect, ___quote _15_ is not an admission of defeat. It is an act of intellectual maturity. It is the recognition that the universe is not obligated to be intelligible to us in its entirety. It is the final, sober lesson from the dust. Some knowledge is not lost but simply gone. And so the trail of this lonely language does not lead us to a hidden truth. It leads us to a wall. And standing before that wall, we can finally ask the real question. If the ultimate secret of Sumer is not encoded in their grammar, then what is the true lost knowledge they left behind? And so, here, at what feels like the journey's end, we must take a step back and look at the path we have travelled. We began in the dust with the grand and beautiful myth of a civilization that appeared from nowhere, fully formed. But as we dug deeper, that myth dissolved. In its place, we found the slow, patient work of bureaucracy. We came looking for the secrets of the gods, and we found the patient accounting of grain. We picked up the Sumerian King List, hoping to find an astronomical code that would unlock the secrets of a lost golden age. Instead, we found a technology of power, a political charter designed to turn a messy, contested history into a single, straight line of divine authority. We went searching for a global, world-ending flood, and we found the very real, very terrifying memory of regional traumas, catastrophes of water and mud that were burned into the cultural mind and magnified into myth. At every turn, the exciting, spectacular explanation has given way to one that is more human, more institutional, and more terrestrial. At every turn, the mystery has been not a secret, but a system, and it would be easy to conclude here that the investigation has been a process of disenchantment, that we have simply replaced a grand mystery with a series of mundane explanations, but that would be to miss the point entirely. Because in stripping away these layers of myth, the ancient astronauts, the secret codes, the landing pads, we have not destroyed the mystery, we have only relocated it. The true mystery of Sumer is not hidden in the fantastical details of its stories. It is hidden in the simple, brutal fact of its existence and its disappearance. We came looking for their lost knowledge, but we were looking for the wrong thing. We were looking for information, star charts, forgotten technologies, the blueprints of a more advanced world. The real lost knowledge of Sumer is not a piece of data. It is a perspective. It is the visceral, bone-deep understanding that civilization is a temporary condition. It is the knowledge that everything you have built, your cities, your laws, your gods, your very language, can be washed away, leaving behind nothing but silt and silence. This is the secret that the dust truly holds, not the secret of how their world began, but the secret of how it ended. The real lost knowledge is the wisdom of a world that has already experienced its own apocalypse, and the terrifying truth is that this knowledge cannot be taught. It can only be lived. And so, this entire journey into their past has been, in truth, a way of looking into a mirror. Their story is not just an artifact, it is a prologue. And so we are left with a quiet, uncomfortable truth. The real lost knowledge is not some secret technology or a forgotten cosmic song. The real lost knowledge is the simple, brutal awareness of our own fragility. We have spent this entire journey searching for the hero of the Sumerian story. We looked for them among the kings with impossible lifespans and among the gods who came down from the sky. We listened for them in the silence of a lonely language, but we were looking in the wrong place. The true hero of this story is not a person. It is not an idea. It is an object, a humble, profoundly undramatic piece of technology. It's the clay tablet. Think about it. A piece of river mud, mixed with water, shaped by human hands, and left to dry in the sun. That's all it is. It has no moving parts. It has no internal power source. It is the lowest of low-tech. And yet, it is arguably the most successful information storage device ever created by humankind. The Library of Alexandria, with its scrolls of papyrus, burned. The great libraries of Europe, with their parchment and paper, decayed or were destroyed. But the archives of Sumer endured. They endured not in spite of catastrophe, but often because of it. And this is the great, terrible paradox at the heart of their survival. The single greatest enemy of any archive made of paper, wood, or parchment is fire. Fire turns libraries to ash. But what happens when fire sweeps through a Sumerian city? When a palace or a temple burns and collapses upon its own archive? The flames that consume everything else, the wooden beams, the woven reeds, the memory of the living, do not destroy the clay tablets. They bake them. The fire transforms them from hardened mud into ceramic. It makes them permanent. The very disaster that erases the city preserves its records for eternity. This is the quiet heroism of the clay tablet. It did not fight. It did not flee. It simply endured. For 4,000 years, these records of grain, of laws, of myths and kings lay buried in the dark, waiting. They are not a code. They are not a miracle. They are a testament to the profound power of the right material. And now we must turn that lesson upon ourselves. Our civilization has created more information in the last decade than in all of previous history combined. Our knowledge is vast, intricate, and instantly accessible. But on what is it stored? On spinning magnetic platters with a lifespan of a few years. On solid-state drives that can be wiped by a solar flare. Our libraries live in the cloud, on servers that require constant electricity, cooling, and maintenance. Our entire collective memory is built on a foundation of unimaginable fragility. Cut the power, and our world goes silent. The Sumerians, whether by accident or by genius, entrusted their story to the earth itself, and the earth kept it. We have entrusted ours to the lightning, and we can only hope it does not strike. This is the most difficult lesson the dust has to teach us. It is a lesson about time, memory, and the physical substance of knowledge itself. We imagine our own world is permanent. We imagine our knowledge is weightless, eternal, stored in a placeless cloud, accessible from anywhere, forever. We have created a civilization of unprecedented complexity, a global network of information that contains the sum of everything we have ever learned. It is our greatest monument, and it is built on sand. No, that's not quite right. It is built on something far more fragile than sand. It is built on a constant, uninterrupted flow of electricity. It's built on servers in climate-controlled rooms, cooled by water, vulnerable to a solar flare, a targeted attack, or simple, prolonged neglect. Our knowledge is written in languages of light and magnetism, languages that require a long, unbroken chain of technology to be read. An ancient Sumerian scribe could pick up a tablet from 1,000 years before their time and with effort read it. Could you read a file from a floppy disk made just 30 years ago without a museum of technology? The Sumerian flood was water and mud. Our coming floods will have different names, a cascade of climate disasters that destabilizes the global grid, a geopolitical conflict that severs the fiber optic cables lying silent on the ocean floor. Or perhaps something quieter, a slow, creeping digital dark age, where the cost of migrating petabytes of data from one format to the next finally becomes too high, and entire archives are simply left behind, their formats unreadable, their secrets locked away forever by a quiet, technical failure. Our Library of Alexandria is global, but it is also a ghost. It exists only as long as we perform the frantic, energy-intensive ritual of keeping it alive. The clay tablet, once inscribed and baked by the sun, asked for nothing. It simply waited. Our knowledge, by contrast, demands constant tribute. It demands power, cooling, and endless migration. It is a hungry god. And this forces us to ask the final, haunting question. After our flood, whatever form it takes, what will remain? When the power has been out for a century, when our servers have corroded into silence, and our screens are dark and cold, what will a future archaeologist sifting through the dust of our world actually find? What will they be able to hold in their hands? A shard of non-biodegradable plastic, a silicon chip whose delicate architecture tells them nothing, 1 billion books turned to pulp and mulch? What will be the clay tablet of our civilization? What single, durable piece of evidence will whisper to them that we were once here, and that we once knew so much? And so, this is the final, brutal irony buried in the Mesopotamian plain. The people of Sumer, with their reeds and their wet clay, created a memory system so robust that it could withstand the collapse of empires, the burning of cities, and the slow, grinding passage of 5,000 years. Their knowledge has physical weight. It is heavy enough to last. We, in contrast, have created a civilization of ghosts. Our knowledge lives as a flicker of light on a screen, as a silent magnetic charge on a platter that will decay in decades, as a stream of data in a cloud that requires a constant, voracious hunger for energy to simply exist. We have mistaken accessibility for permanence. We have traded the weight of memory for the convenience of the moment. Our entire civilization, our art, our science, our history, rests on a foundation of breathtaking fragility. The investigation into the world before the flood was never truly about finding a lost golden age of impossible technology. It was never about proving that ancient astronauts built the ziggurats. Those are the easy stories, the myths we tell ourselves to avoid the harder truth. The real secret of Sumer is not what was written on the tablets. The secret is the tablet. The secret is that for knowledge to survive, it must be given a body. It must be made of something that can endure the indifference of time. The ultimate lesson from the dust of Mesopotamia, then, is not to look to the stars for saviors who might one day return to rescue us. It is to look down at the earth in our own hands, at the materials of our own world, and to ask a simple, terrifying question. What will survive us? What are we building that is heavy enough to last? This is the task, not to become gods, but to become ancestors, to think on a timescale that extends beyond our own lives, beyond the next quarter, beyond the next election. To understand that we are writing our own king list with every byte of data we create and every flimsy medium on which we store it. We are the ones creating the canon for a future that will have to dig through the silent, sterile layers of our own collapsed world. What will they find? Will they find a coherent memory, or just the digital equivalent of scattered dust? The silence that lives in the dust between two rivers is not an empty silence. We know that now. It is a question etched in clay and fired by the heat of a fallen world, and now it is our turn to answer.